Picture this. You wake up at dawn, not to an alarm clock, but to the sound of your neighbor dumping a bucket of human waste out their window. The smell hits you like a medieval freight train. You stumble to your kitchen, but there's no coffee, no cereal, no refrigerator. Just stale bread that's harder than concrete and water that might literally kill you. Welcome to your life in medieval times, where a simple headache could be your death sentence, and taking a bath was considered dangerous to your health. Think your Monday mornings are rough? By the end of this video, you'll be kissing your smartphone and thanking the universe for indoor plumbing. But first, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're about to dive deep into the absolutely miserable reality of medieval life. Trust me, you'll want to share this wake-up call with everyone who thinks they were born in the wrong era. Hello, history lovers and insomniacs. Welcome back to Medieval Historical, where we make the past so detailed and thorough that you'll either learn something fascinating or drift off to dreamland. I'm your host, and tonight we're exploring why medieval times were absolutely, categorically, undeniably terrible for the average person. Now, I know what you're thinking. But what about knights in shining armor? What about castles and chivalry? Well, buckle up, because we're about to shatter every romantic notion you've ever had about the Middle Ages. This isn't Game of Thrones, folks. This is the gritty, smelly, painful reality of life between roughly 500 and 1500 CE. Before we begin our journey through medieval misery, let's set some ground rules. When I say medieval times, I'm talking about Western Europe during the Middle Ages. Life varied dramatically depending on where and when you lived, but we'll focus on the experiences of common people, the 95% of the population who weren't nobles living in relative luxury. So grab your favorite blanket, get comfortable, and prepare to feel incredibly grateful for your modern life. And remember, if you enjoy this deep dive into historical hardship, please give us a thumbs up and let us know in the comments what other historical periods you'd like us to explore. Trust me, there are plenty of terrible times to choose from. Let's start with something we all take for granted, going to the bathroom. In medieval times, this basic human need was a nightmare of epic proportions. First, forget everything you know about privacy. Medieval people didn't have individual bathrooms, or even individual toilets. If you were lucky enough to live in a castle, you might have access to a garderobe, essentially a small room with a wooden seat over a hole that dropped straight down into the moat or a pit below. Imagine sitting on that seat during winter, with freezing wind whipping up through the hole. But here's the kicker: these garderobes were often shared by multiple families, and there was no concept of personal space or privacy. For the vast majority of people who didn't live in castles, the situation was even worse. Most people used chamber pots, basically decorative buckets that they kept in their bedrooms. These pots would be emptied, well, wherever was convenient. Often, this meant opening the window and dumping the contents directly into the street below. In fact, in many medieval cities, people would shout "Garde à l'eau," derived from the French garde à l'eau, meaning watch out for the water, before emptying their chamber pots out the window. The streets of medieval cities were essentially open sewers. Human waste, animal waste, rotting food scraps, and other refuse created a putrid soup that people had to navigate daily. During rain, this waste would flow through the streets in rivers of filth. During dry periods, it would dry into a crusty, disease-ridden layer that would kick up dust clouds when walked on. But wait, it gets worse. Toilet paper wasn't invented until the 14th century in China, and it didn't reach Europe until much later. So what did medieval people use? Well, if you were wealthy, you might use soft cloths or even wool. If you were poor, you used whatever was available: leaves, sticks, stones, or even your own hand. Some people used something called a gomp stick, a communal stick with a sponge on the end that was shared by everyone in the community and rinsed in a bucket of salt water. The lack of proper sanitation led to constant disease outbreaks. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever were common killers, all directly related to poor sanitation. Medieval people didn't understand the connection between waste and disease, so they had no motivation to improve their sanitation systems. Now, you might be thinking, surely people bathed regularly to stay clean? Oh, sweet summer child, we'll get to bathing in the next section, but I'll give you a spoiler. It doesn't get better. What's your worst bathroom experience? Drop it in the comments below, and remember, no matter how bad it was, at least you weren't sharing a gomp stick with your neighbors. Speaking of cleanliness, let's talk about medieval bathing habits, or rather, the lack thereof. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people didn't avoid bathing because they were inherently dirty or lazy. They avoided it because they genuinely believed it was dangerous to their health. Medieval medical theory was based on the concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Physicians believed that bathing could upset the delicate balance of these humors, leading to illness or death. They thought that hot water would open the pores, allowing diseases to enter the body. This wasn't just superstition, it was considered legitimate medical advice. The Catholic Church also discouraged bathing, viewing it as a form of vanity and self-indulgence. They believed that physical cleanliness was less important than spiritual purity. In fact, many saints were praised specifically for their lack of bathing. Saint Francis of Assisi called his body brother ass, and deliberately avoided washing to mortify the flesh. So how often did medieval people bathe? Well, it varied, but many people went months or even years without a full bath. The wealthy might bathe a few times a year, usually before major religious holidays. The poor might never fully immerse themselves in water their entire lives. Instead of bathing, medieval people relied on other methods of staying clean. They would change their undergarments, if they had any, and use dry cleaning methods. They would rub their bodies with linen cloths to remove dirt and dead skin. They used strong perfumes and herbs to mask body odors. Wealthy people might dust themselves with powder or use scented oils. But here's where it gets really gross. Medieval people believed that a layer of dirt and grime actually protected them from disease. They thought that this protective layer acted as a barrier against harmful air and evil spirits. So not only did they avoid bathing, they actively cultivated their filth. The results were predictable. Body lice were universal. Everyone from peasants to kings had them. Fleas were constant companions. Skin diseases were rampant. Medieval people scratched constantly, leading to open sores that would become infected. The smell must have been absolutely overwhelming. Hair care was similarly neglected. People rarely washed their hair, and when they did, they used harsh soaps made from animal fat and ash that would strip the scalp and leave hair brittle and damaged. Many people simply kept their hair covered with hoods or caps to hide its condition. Dental hygiene was practically non-existent. People cleaned their teeth with rough cloths and sometimes used twigs as primitive toothbrushes, but tooth decay was universal. By the time someone reached middle age, they would have lost most of their teeth. The combination of poor dental hygiene and the lack of understanding about oral health meant that tooth abscesses, which can be fatal, were common. The wealthy had slightly better access to what passed for medieval cosmetics and hygiene products, but even these were often dangerous. Face paints contained lead and other toxic substances. Hair dyes were made from urine and other unsavory ingredients. Perfumes were so strong they could cause headaches and nausea. Here's a fun fact that might help you sleep. Medieval people were so used to their own stench that they developed a tolerance for it. What would make us gag and vomit was just normal life for them. They literally couldn't smell how bad they smelled. Before we move on to medieval food, and trust me, it's another horror story, let me ask you this. What's the longest you've gone without a shower? Let us know in the comments, and remember to subscribe if you're enjoying this journey through medieval misery. Now let's talk about medieval food, and spoiler alert, you would have hated dinner time in the Middle Ages. Forget everything you think you know about hearty medieval feasts. Those were reserved for the wealthy, and even then, they were nothing like what you see in movies. For the average medieval person, food was a constant source of anxiety. Most people lived on the edge of starvation, and famine was a regular occurrence. The weather, crop diseases, and war could all lead to food shortages that would kill thousands. The medieval diet was incredibly limited and monotonous. The foundation of every meal was bread, but not the fluffy, white bread you're thinking of. Medieval bread was dense, dark, and often full of foreign objects. Bakers would add sawdust, ground acorns, and even dirt to stretch their flour supplies. The bread was so hard that people would often soak it in liquid just to make it chewable. But here's the truly horrifying part. Medieval people didn't understand food safety. They had no refrigeration, no understanding of bacteria, and no concept of proper food storage. Meat was often spoiled by the time it reached the table. They would try to mask the taste of rotten meat with heavy spices, not because they liked spicy food, but because they had no choice. Food poisoning was a constant threat. People regularly got sick from eating contaminated food, and they had no medical treatments for foodborne illnesses. Diarrhea and vomiting were just accepted as normal parts of life. The protein sources available to medieval people were limited and often disgusting. Pork was the most common meat, but it was frequently infected with parasites. Beef was rare and expensive. Fish was more common, but it was often salted or dried to the point of being nearly inedible. During Lent, people were required to abstain from meat for 40 days, surviving on bread, vegetables, and whatever fish they could find. But wait, there's more. Medieval people ate meat from animals we would never consider food today. Rats, cats, dogs, and even insects were fair game during times of scarcity. They ate every part of the animal, including organs that are now considered pet food. Blood sausage, brain pudding, and tripe were common dishes. Vegetables were often viewed with suspicion. Many people believed that eating too many vegetables could cause illness or make you weak. They preferred grains and meat, which meant they suffered from scurvy, rickets, and other diseases caused by vitamin deficiencies. The quality of medieval food was also questionable. Grain was often moldy, which could cause ergot poisoning, a condition that could lead to hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Milk was frequently sour or contaminated. Eggs were often rotten. Cooking methods were primitive and dangerous. Most people cooked over open fires in their homes, which filled their living spaces with smoke and created a constant fire hazard. Many medieval homes burned down because of cooking accidents. Food preservation was a constant challenge. People used salt, smoke, and drying to preserve meat, but these methods were not always effective. Pickled vegetables were common, but they were often made with dirty water and contaminated utensils. The social aspects of eating were also harsh. Meals were often communal affairs, with multiple people eating from the same bowl with their hands. Personal utensils were rare, and people would share knives and spoons. This communal eating style spread diseases rapidly through families and communities. Now, let's talk about drinks. Because medieval people had a good reason to avoid water, it was often contaminated with human waste and disease. Instead, they drank ale, beer, and wine, even children. The alcohol content was usually low, but it was enough to kill some bacteria and make the liquid safer to drink. However, medieval alcohol was often contaminated too. Beer was made with dirty water and stored in unsanitary conditions. Wine was frequently watered down or mixed with questionable substances. People would drink these beverages throughout the day, leading to chronic dehydration and liver problems. The wealthy had access to better food, but even their meals were problematic. They used lead-based glazes on their pottery, which caused lead poisoning. They ate with pewter utensils, which also contained lead. Their rich diet, high in meat and low in vegetables, caused gout and other health problems. Medieval people had no understanding of nutrition. They didn't know about vitamins, minerals, or balanced diets. They ate whatever was available, whenever it was available, and hoped for the best. Here's something that might surprise you. Medieval people were generally much smaller than we are today, largely due to malnutrition. The average height for men was around 5 feet 6 inches, and women were even shorter. They were also much thinner, not by choice, but because they simply didn't have enough food. Before we move on to medieval healthcare, and trust me, it's absolutely terrifying, let me ask you this. What's the worst meal you've ever had? Share it in the comments, and remember, it was probably still better than what medieval people ate every day. Hold on to your hats, folks, because we're about to dive into medieval healthcare, and it's going to make you want to hug your doctor and kiss your health insurance card. Medieval medicine was based on a combination of superstition, religion, and ancient Greek theories that were completely wrong. Doctors, and I use that term very loosely, believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of the four humors I mentioned earlier. Their treatments were designed to restore this balance, but they usually made patients worse, not better. Let's start with the most famous medieval medical practice, bloodletting. Medieval doctors believed that most illnesses were caused by having too much blood in the body. So their solution was to drain some of it out. They would make cuts in the patient's arms or legs and let the blood flow into bowls. Sometimes they would use leeches to suck out the blood. But here's the problem: bloodletting weakened patients and made them more susceptible to infection and death. It was particularly dangerous for people who were already sick or injured. Yet this practice continued for centuries because doctors didn't understand that they were actually harming their patients. Medieval surgery was a nightmare beyond imagination. Surgeons had no understanding of anesthesia, antiseptics, or anatomy. They would perform operations on fully conscious patients, often leading to death from shock or pain. They used dirty instruments and didn't wash their hands between patients, spreading infection and disease. The mortality rate for medieval surgery was astronomical. Simple procedures that we consider routine today were often fatal. Amputation was common, but most patients died from infection or blood loss. Even minor procedures like tooth extraction could lead to death from infection. Medieval doctors had no understanding of germs or disease transmission. They believed that illness was caused by bad air or evil spirits. They would often blame the patient for their illness, claiming it was punishment for sin or moral failings. The treatments prescribed by medieval doctors were often bizarre and harmful. They would prescribe mixtures of animal parts, human urine, and poisonous plants. They believed that if a medicine tasted terrible, it was more likely to be effective. Some common treatments included drinking powdered unicorn horn, which was actually ground narwhal tusk, applying leeches to various parts of the body, eating crushed pearls, drinking mercury, applying hot irons to wounds, eating human flesh. Yes, really. Medieval dentistry was particularly horrifying. Tooth decay was universal, but the treatments were often worse than the disease. Dentists would use crude tools to extract teeth, often breaking the jaw or causing massive infections. They would sometimes try to fill cavities with lead or other toxic substances. Pain management was primitive and ineffective. Medieval people suffered through excruciating pain with little relief. They might use alcohol or opium-based medicines, but these were expensive and often unavailable. Most people simply had to endure their pain. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous for both mothers and babies. The maternal mortality rate was around 20%, meaning 1 in 5 women died during or shortly after childbirth. Many babies died during birth or in their first year of life. Medieval midwives had no understanding of hygiene or proper birthing techniques. Mental illness was completely misunderstood. People with mental health issues were often believed to be possessed by demons or cursed by God. They were frequently locked up, tortured, or killed. There was no concept of mental health care or therapy. Plague was a constant threat during medieval times. The Black Death killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people in the 14th century, wiping out 30 to 60% of Europe's population. Medieval doctors had no understanding of how plague spread or how to treat it. Their treatments often made the disease worse. Medieval hospitals were more like hospices than medical facilities. They were run by religious orders and focused on providing spiritual comfort rather than medical treatment. Patients were often crowded together in unsanitary conditions, which helped spread disease. The wealthy had access to better medical care, but even their doctors were working with the same flawed theories and dangerous treatments. Being rich might get you a doctor who used more expensive ingredients in his potions, but it didn't make the treatment any more effective. Medieval people had no understanding of disease prevention. They didn't know about the importance of clean water, proper sanitation, or nutritious food. They lived in conditions that promoted disease and had no idea how to protect themselves. Life expectancy in medieval times was brutally short. Most people died before the age of 40, and many children died before their 5th birthday. Disease, accident, and violence claimed lives at rates that would be unthinkable today. One of the most disturbing aspects of medieval medicine was the belief in supernatural causes of disease. Doctors would often prescribe prayers, pilgrimages, or religious rituals as treatments. They believed that God was punishing people for their sins, so the cure was spiritual rather than medical. Medieval people also believed in the power of astrology in medicine. Doctors would consult star charts before treating patients, believing that the position of the planets affected human health. They would time treatments and surgeries according to astrological calendars. Here's a question for you. What's the worst medical experience you've ever had? Share it in the comments, and remember, it probably involved clean instruments, pain medication, and a doctor who actually knew what they were doing. Now that we've covered the horrifying basics of medieval life, let's talk about what a typical day actually looked like for our unfortunate medieval ancestors. Spoiler alert, it was a grinding, exhausting struggle for survival that would make your worst Monday look like a spa day. Medieval people woke up at dawn, not by choice, but because they had no artificial lighting. Candles were expensive and dangerous, so most people went to bed when the sun set and woke up when it rose. Their sleep was frequently interrupted by cold, hunger, pain, and the sounds of animals and neighbors in their cramped living spaces. Speaking of living spaces, medieval homes were absolutely awful. The average peasant family lived in a one-room house that they shared with their animals. These houses were made of wood, mud, and straw, with no insulation and gaps in the walls that let in cold air, rain, and pests. The floors were usually dirt, covered with rushes or straw that would quickly become filthy and need to be replaced. The roof was typically made of thatch, which leaked constantly and was home to countless insects and vermin. In winter, these homes were freezing cold. In summer, they were swelteringly hot. There was no privacy, no quiet, and no escape from the constant noise and smell of other people and animals. Furniture was almost non-existent. Most people slept on straw mattresses on the floor, which they shared with multiple family members. They had no chairs, tables, or dressers. Their few possessions were stored in sacks or baskets hung from the walls. Lighting was a constant problem. Candles were too expensive for most people, so they used rush lights, reeds dipped in animal fat that produced a weak, smoky flame. These lights were dim, smelly, and constantly needed to be replaced. Most indoor activities stopped when the sun went down. Heating was provided by a central fire pit in the middle of the room. This fire was used for cooking, warmth, and light, but it filled the house with smoke because there was no proper chimney. The smoke would eventually find its way out through holes in the roof or walls, but not before making the air inside barely breathable. Medieval people wore the same clothes for months or even years without washing them. Clothing was expensive and time-consuming to make, so most people owned only one or two outfits. These clothes were made of rough, scratchy materials that chafed the skin and provided little protection from the elements. Underwear was rare and usually made of coarse linen that was never washed. Most people wore layers of dirty, smelly clothing that harbored lice, fleas, and other parasites. The wealthy might have had slightly better clothing, but even they rarely washed their garments. Work began at sunrise and didn't end until sunset. Medieval people worked 6 days a week, with Sunday being the only day of rest. Most people were farmers, and farming in medieval times was backbreaking labor done with primitive tools. They had no machinery, no fertilizers, and no understanding of crop rotation or soil management. During planting and harvest seasons, people worked from dawn to dusk with only brief breaks for meals. The work was physically demanding and dangerous. Farm accidents were common, and a broken bone or serious injury could mean death or permanent disability. For those who weren't farmers, life was equally difficult. Craftsmen worked in poorly lit, poorly ventilated workshops. Merchants faced constant dangers from thieves, bandits, and corrupt officials. Servants worked long hours for little pay and no job security. Education was virtually non-existent for most people. The vast majority of medieval people couldn't read or write. They had no books, no schools, and no access to information beyond what was passed down orally. This ignorance made them vulnerable to superstition, fraud, and manipulation. Entertainment was limited and often dangerous. Medieval people might attend public executions, bear baiting, or other violent spectacles. They had no concept of indoor plumbing entertainment, no books to read, and no games to play. Music was rare and usually limited to religious songs or folk ballads. Travel was extremely dangerous and uncomfortable. There were no roads as we understand them today, just muddy tracks that became impassable during bad weather. Travelers faced constant threats from bandits, wild animals, and hostile locals. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. Communication was slow and unreliable. There was no postal system, no newspapers, and no way to quickly spread information. News traveled by word of mouth, which meant it was often inaccurate or completely false by the time it reached its destination. Medieval people had no concept of personal time or leisure. Every moment was focused on survival. They had to constantly worry about finding enough food, staying warm, avoiding disease, and protecting themselves from violence and crime. The legal system was harsh and unfair. Medieval justice was based on superstition and corruption rather than evidence or fairness. Punishments were severe and public. People could be executed, tortured, or mutilated for relatively minor crimes. Social mobility was virtually impossible. People were born into their social class and stayed there for life. Peasants remained peasants, and nobles remained nobles. There was no concept of earning your way to a better life through hard work or education. Women had it even worse than men. They had no legal rights, no property rights, and no control over their own lives. They were considered property of their fathers and then their husbands. They faced constant danger from childbirth, domestic violence, and sexual assault. Children were treated as small adults and were expected to work from an early age. They had no toys, no games, and no childhood as we understand it. Many children died young from disease, accident, or abuse. What's your biggest daily complaint? Traffic? Slow Wi-Fi? A long line at the coffee shop? Share it in the comments and remember how good you have it. If you thought medieval life couldn't get any worse, wait until you hear about the violence and crime that was just a normal part of daily existence. Medieval society was incredibly violent, and the justice system was designed more for entertainment than actual justice. Murder was disturbingly common in medieval times. The homicide rate was 10 to 50 times higher than in modern developed countries. People killed each other over minor disputes, perceived insults, or simple disagreements. Weapons were readily available, and there was little to no law enforcement to prevent violence. Domestic violence was not only common but legally acceptable. Husbands were allowed to beat their wives, and this was considered normal and even necessary for maintaining household order. The phrase rule of thumb actually comes from a medieval law that said a man could beat his wife with a stick as long as it was no thicker than his thumb. Public executions were major social events. People would gather to watch criminals being hanged, beheaded, drawn and quartered, or burned at the stake. These executions were designed to be as gruesome and painful as possible, serving as both entertainment and deterrent. The methods of execution were incredibly creative and horrifying. Drawing and quartering involved tying the victim to 4 horses and having them pull in different directions until the person was literally torn apart. Burning at the stake was reserved for heretics and witches. Hanging was common, but it was often done slowly to maximize suffering. Torture was a standard part of the legal process. Suspects were routinely tortured to extract confessions, and the torture devices were designed to cause maximum pain without killing the victim too quickly. The rack, thumbscrews, and Iron Maiden were just a few of the instruments used to break people's bodies and spirits. Medieval prisons were hellholes where people were left to rot. There was no concept of rehabilitation or prisoner rights. Prisoners were often chained to walls in dark, damp dungeons where they would be forgotten and left to die. Many prisoners died from starvation, disease, or exposure before they could be tried. The legal system was completely corrupt and unfair. Justice was based on social class, not evidence or law. Nobles could literally get away with murder, while peasants could be executed for stealing a loaf of bread. Trials were often public spectacles where the outcome was predetermined. Trial by ordeal was a common way to determine guilt or innocence. The accused might be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar, plunge their hand into boiling water, or be thrown into a pond. If they survived without serious injury, they were considered innocent. If they were injured or died, they were guilty. This system was obviously rigged against the poor and weak. Banditry was rampant throughout medieval Europe. Highways were infested with robbers who would attack travelers, steal their possessions, and often kill them. These bandits were sometimes former soldiers or peasants who had lost their land and turned to crime to survive. Pirates were a constant threat to coastal communities and merchant ships. They would raid villages, capture people to sell as slaves, and steal anything of value. The Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts were particularly dangerous because of pirate activity. War was a constant reality of medieval life. Countries were constantly fighting each other, and these wars had devastating effects on civilian populations. Armies would march through the countryside, destroying crops, burning villages, and killing or enslaving the inhabitants. Medieval warfare was incredibly brutal. Soldiers used swords, spears, crossbows, and other weapons designed to cause maximum damage. Battles were chaotic, bloody affairs where thousands of men would hack each other to pieces. Medical care for wounded soldiers was non-existent, so even minor injuries often led to death. Siege warfare was particularly horrifying for civilians. When an army besieged a city, they would cut off all food and water supplies, trying to starve the inhabitants into surrender. These sieges could last for months, during which time people inside the city would slowly starve to death. The feudal system itself was based on violence and intimidation. Lords maintained their power through the threat of violence, and peasants were kept in line through fear. Any challenge to the established order was met with brutal punishment. Medieval cities were dangerous places where crime was common and law enforcement was minimal. Thieves, murderers, and con artists operated openly in the streets. People carried weapons for protection, which only made the cities more dangerous. Drunkenness was a major problem in medieval society. Since water was often contaminated, people drank alcohol throughout the day, including children. This constant intoxication led to increased violence, accidents, and poor decision-making. Blood feuds were common, where families would carry on violent conflicts for generations. These feuds could start over minor disputes but would escalate into cycles of revenge that could last for decades and result in numerous deaths. The concept of individual rights simply didn't exist. People were property of their lords, and they could be bought, sold, or killed at will. There was no appeal process, no higher authority to turn to, and no concept of human dignity or worth. Medieval people lived in constant fear of violence. They couldn't trust their neighbors, their lords, or even their own family members. Violence was so common that it was considered a normal part of life. Here's a sobering thought. The next time you have a disagreement with someone, think about how lucky you are that you can resolve it with words instead of swords. What's the worst argument you've ever had? Share it in the comments, and remember, at least nobody got drawn and quartered. Medieval life was dominated by religion and superstition to a degree that would be unimaginable today. The Catholic Church controlled virtually every aspect of people's lives, and superstitious beliefs influenced every decision, from what to eat to when to plant crops. The Church was the ultimate authority in medieval society. It controlled education, healthcare, law, and even politics. Kings and nobles bowed to the authority of the Pope, and ordinary people were completely at the mercy of local priests and bishops. Medieval people believed that every aspect of their lives was controlled by God, and that suffering was a test of faith or punishment for sin. This belief system made people incredibly passive and accepting of their miserable conditions. They didn't try to improve their lives because they thought their suffering was divinely ordained. The fear of hell was constant and overwhelming. Medieval people believed that the slightest sin could condemn them to eternal torture. They lived in terror of accidentally breaking religious rules or failing to perform required religious duties. This fear was deliberately cultivated by the Church to maintain control over the population. Religious services were conducted in Latin, which most people couldn't understand. They would attend Mass regularly but have no idea what was being said. This created a mystical atmosphere that made people feel ignorant and dependent on the priests for spiritual guidance. The church sold indulgences, basically get-out-of-hell-free cards that people could purchase to reduce their time in purgatory. This system was incredibly corrupt and exploited people's genuine fear of damnation. Poor people would give their last coins to buy indulgences, even if it meant their families would starve. Medieval people believed in a literal interpretation of the Bible that led to bizarre and harmful practices. They thought that illness was caused by sin, so they would pray and perform religious rituals instead of seeking medical treatment. They believed that bathing was sinful because it involved nudity and self-indulgence. Superstition was rampant and affected every aspect of daily life. People believed in witches, demons, vampires, and other supernatural creatures. They thought that certain days were unlucky, that breaking a mirror would bring bad luck, and that various animals and objects had magical powers. The fear of witches led to widespread persecution and murder. Thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft and executed. The accusation of witchcraft could be made by anyone and was almost impossible to disprove. Many innocent people were tortured and killed based on nothing more than superstition and fear. Medieval people believed that natural disasters were punishments from God. When earthquakes, floods, or famines occurred, they would blame themselves for their sins and perform religious rituals to appease God's anger. They never considered that these disasters had natural causes that could be understood and prevented. Astrology was taken very seriously in medieval times. People believed that the positions of the stars and planets controlled human destiny. They would consult astrologers before making important decisions, and they believed that certain times were lucky or unlucky based on astronomical events. The church promoted anti-intellectual attitudes that kept people ignorant and dependent. They taught that curiosity about the natural world was sinful and that questioning religious doctrine was heretical. This attitude stifled scientific progress and kept people trapped in ignorance. Medieval people believed in the power of relics, pieces of dead saints' bodies or objects that had touched them. They thought these relics could perform miracles and cure diseases. The trade in fake relics was enormous, and people would spend fortunes on worthless bones and cloth scraps. Pilgrimages were major undertakings that could take months or years to complete. People would travel hundreds of miles to visit religious sites, often suffering tremendous hardship and danger. They believed that completing a pilgrimage would earn them spiritual merit and forgiveness for their sins. The church taught that the earth was the center of the universe and that humans were God's special creation. This geocentric worldview made people feel important but also trapped them in a limited understanding of the world around them. Medieval people believed that God directly intervened in human affairs through miracles and divine justice. They thought that good people would be rewarded and evil people would be punished, even though their daily experience clearly contradicted this belief. The concept of free will was limited by the belief in predestination, the idea that God had already decided who would go to heaven and who would go to hell. This created a sense of fatalism that made people feel powerless to change their circumstances. Medieval Christianity was obsessed with sin and punishment. People were taught that they were inherently evil and deserved to suffer. This constant focus on sin and guilt created a culture of shame and self-hatred that made mental health problems even worse. Religious festivals and holy days were the only breaks from the grinding routine of medieval life, but even these were often occasions for excess drinking, violence, and debauchery. The church tried to control these celebrations, but they often got out of hand and led to more problems than they solved. The church's attitude toward women was particularly harmful. Women were viewed as inherently sinful and dangerous, the daughters of Eve who had caused mankind's fall from grace. They were considered intellectually and morally inferior to men and were blamed for most of society's problems. Medieval people believed that natural phenomena like eclipses, comets, and unusual weather were signs from God. They would interpret these events as warnings of coming disasters or divine displeasure. This constant state of anxiety about supernatural signs made daily life even more stressful. The Black Death was interpreted as God's punishment for humanity's sins. Instead of trying to understand the disease and find medical solutions, people focused on praying, flagellating themselves, and persecuting minorities whom they blamed for the plague. This religious response made the pandemic even more devastating. What superstitions do you still believe in today? Knock on wood, avoid black cats, or throw salt over your shoulder. Share them in the comments. At least yours probably won't get you burned at the stake. If you think being an adult in medieval times was bad, being a child was infinitely worse. Medieval childhood was a brief, brutal experience that most kids didn't survive, and those who did were scarred for life. First, let's talk about infant mortality. In medieval times, between 30% and 50% of children died before their 5th birthday. That means if you had 4 children, you could expect to lose at least 1 or 2 of them. Parents couldn't afford to get too attached to their babies because there was such a high chance they wouldn't survive. Medieval people didn't really have a concept of childhood as we understand it today. Children were seen as miniature adults who just hadn't grown up yet. As soon as they could walk and talk, they were expected to contribute to the family's survival through work. Child labor was universal and brutal. Children as young as 5 or 6 would work in the fields, help with household chores, or learn trades through apprenticeships. These weren't light duties. Children performed backbreaking labor for 12 to 14 hours a day, often in dangerous conditions that would be considered child abuse today. Education was virtually non-existent for most children. The vast majority of medieval people couldn't read or write, and there were no schools for common children. Only the children of nobles and wealthy merchants had access to education, and even then, it was limited and focused mainly on religious instruction. For the few children who did receive education, the experience was harsh and violent. Medieval teachers believed that children learned best through fear and pain. Students were regularly beaten for making mistakes, asking questions, or showing any sign of curiosity or independence. Medieval schools used corporal punishment as their primary teaching method. Children would be hit with sticks, whips, and other implements for even minor infractions. The phrase, "spare the rod and spoil the child," was taken very literally, and teachers competed to see who could be the most brutal. Toys were almost non-existent for medieval children. Most families couldn't afford to waste resources on items that didn't contribute to survival. Children might play with sticks, stones, or simple dolls made from scraps of cloth, but elaborate toys were a luxury only the wealthy could afford. Child marriages were common, especially among the nobility. Girls could be betrothed as infants and married as young as 12 or 13. These marriages were political and economic arrangements that had nothing to do with love or compatibility. Children had no say in who they would marry or when. Medieval children were exposed to violence, death, and adult responsibilities from an early age. They would witness public executions, help slaughter animals for food, and care for sick and dying family members. There was no attempt to shield children from the harsh realities of life. Abuse was common and accepted. Parents, teachers, masters, and other adults could beat, starve, or otherwise mistreat children with no consequences. Children were considered property, and their owners could do whatever they wanted with them. Many children were sold into apprenticeships or servitude to reduce the financial burden on their families. These arrangements were often little better than slavery, with children working long hours for little food and no pay. Many apprentices were abused by their masters and had no recourse for help. Childhood diseases were major killers. Without vaccines or proper medical care, diseases like measles, whooping cough, and smallpox devastated medieval children. Parents would watch helplessly as their children suffered and died from illnesses that are easily preventable today. Malnutrition was chronic among medieval children. They were often the last to eat and received the smallest portions of food. Stunted growth, rickets, and other signs of malnutrition were visible in most children who survived to adulthood. Medieval children had no concept of playtime or leisure. Every moment was focused on work, survival, or religious instruction. They had no childhood friends, no games to play, and no time to just be kids. Their lives were focused entirely on preparing for the hard life of a medieval adult. Orphans had it even worse than other children. There were no orphanages or social services to care for children who lost their parents. Orphaned children often became beggars, thieves, or prostitutes just to survive. Many died of starvation or exposure on the streets. The few children who survived to adulthood were often physically and emotionally damaged by their experiences. They had no understanding of nurturing, love, or emotional support because they had never experienced these things themselves. Medieval parents loved their children, but they couldn't afford to show it. Emotional attachment was seen as a weakness that could make the inevitable loss of children even more painful. Parents kept emotional distance from their children as a survival mechanism. Child abandonment was common when families couldn't afford to feed all their children. Parents would leave infants on church steps or in forests, hoping that someone else would take them in. Most of these abandoned children died. Think about your own childhood, your toys, your games, your education, your parents' protection and love. What's your best childhood memory? Share it in the comments and take a moment to appreciate how different your life has been from a medieval child's experience. We've covered a lot of ground in our journey through medieval misery, but now we need to talk about the elephant in the room, death. In medieval times, death wasn't a distant possibility that people might face in old age. It was a constant, immediate threat that stalked everyone every single day. Life expectancy in medieval times was shockingly short. The average person died before age 40, and many didn't make it past 30. But these numbers are actually misleading because they include the massive infant mortality rates. If you managed to survive childhood, you might live to 50 or 60, but that was still considered an remarkably long life. Medieval people lived with the knowledge that they could die at any moment from causes that would be easily treatable today. A simple cut could become infected and kill you. A broken bone could lead to blood poisoning. A toothache could develop into a fatal abscess. People died from things we consider minor inconveniences. Accidents were incredibly common and often fatal. Farm accidents with primitive tools regularly maimed or killed workers. House fires were frequent because of the combination of open flames, wooden structures, and thatched roofs. People fell into wells, were kicked by horses, or were crushed by falling objects with alarming regularity. Infectious diseases swept through medieval communities like wildfire. Without understanding of germs or disease transmission, people had no way to protect themselves from epidemics. Entire families would be wiped out in a matter of days when disease struck their community. The Black Death was the ultimate medieval nightmare. This bubonic plague pandemic killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people in the 14th century, roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's entire population. Imagine living through a time when half the people you knew died within a few years. During plague outbreaks, medieval cities became ghost towns. Bodies piled up in the streets because there weren't enough living people to bury the dead. Families abandoned sick relatives, and children were left orphaned with no one to care for them. The social fabric of entire communities completely collapsed. Medieval people developed a morbid obsession with death that permeated their culture. Art, literature, and music all focused heavily on death and dying. Churches were decorated with skulls and skeletons to remind people of their mortality. The phrase, memento mori, remember you must die, was a common greeting. Violent death was so common that it barely merited comment. People were murdered over trivial disputes, killed in accidents, or executed for minor crimes. Medieval chronicles record deaths with the same casual tone they might use to describe the weather. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. With no understanding of hygiene, anatomy, or medical intervention, roughly 20% of women died during or shortly after childbirth. Many women would write their wills before giving birth because they knew there was a good chance they wouldn't survive. Medieval people had no effective pain management for serious injuries or illnesses. They would suffer through excruciating pain with little relief until they died. The lucky ones might have access to alcohol or opium-based medicines, but most people simply had to endure their agony. Famine was a regular occurrence that could kill thousands of people in a single region. Poor harvests, bad weather, or warfare could quickly lead to starvation. During famines, people would eat anything they could find: bark, grass, leather, and even human flesh in the most desperate cases. Winter was particularly deadly for medieval people. Without adequate heating, insulation, or nutrition, many people simply froze to death in their homes. The elderly, the young, and the sick were especially vulnerable during the cold months. Medieval warfare killed not just soldiers but entire civilian populations. Armies would deliberately target non-combatants, burning crops, destroying homes, and massacring villagers. Being in the path of an army was often a death sentence for everyone in the area. The justice system was designed to kill people for even minor crimes. Theft, adultery, heresy, and countless other offenses were punishable by death. Public executions were so common that they became routine entertainment for the masses. Medieval people believed that sudden death was a punishment from God, while a slow, painful death allowed time for repentance and salvation. This belief led them to see suffering as spiritually beneficial, which made them less likely to seek medical treatment or try to prevent pain. Suicide was considered a mortal sin that would condemn someone to hell, but the conditions of medieval life drove many people to take their own lives anyway. The despair and hopelessness of medieval existence was so overwhelming that some people chose damnation over continued suffering. Medieval cemeteries were constantly expanding because death was so common. Graveyards would quickly fill up, forcing people to dig up old graves to make room for new bodies. The sight and smell of death was a constant presence in medieval communities. People wrote their wills at young ages because they knew death could come at any time. Medieval wills read like horror stories, with people making arrangements for their children, property, and souls while still in their 20s or 30s. The psychological impact of living with constant death was enormous. Medieval people suffered from what we would now recognize as severe depression, anxiety, and PTSD. They lived in a state of perpetual grief, having lost so many family members, friends, and neighbors. Here's a sobering question. When was the last time you thought about your own mortality? For medieval people, it was probably every single day. Share your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe if this deep dive into medieval mortality has made you appreciate your modern life expectancy. So there you have it, folks, a comprehensive tour through the absolute nightmare that was living in medieval times. From the moment you woke up in your flea-infested straw bed to the moment you fell asleep hoping you'd live to see another day, medieval life was an unrelenting series of hardships that would break most modern people within a week. Let's recap the highlights of this medieval horror show. You would have lived in a one-room house with no bathroom, no privacy, and animals as roommates. You would have gone months without bathing, worn the same clothes until they rotted off your body, and been covered in lice and fleas. Your food would have been spoiled, your water contaminated, and your medical care would have been more likely to kill you than cure you. You would have worked from dawn to dusk 6 days a week doing backbreaking labor with primitive tools. You would have lived in constant fear of violence, disease, and starvation. Your children would have had a 50% chance of dying before age 5, and if they survived, they would have worked alongside you from the moment they could walk. You would have been controlled by superstition and religious fear, believing that your suffering was divinely ordained and that questioning your circumstances was sinful. You would have had no education, no books, no entertainment, and no hope of improving your situation. Most importantly, you would have lived with the constant, immediate threat of death from causes that we consider trivial today. A simple infection, a difficult childbirth, or a bad harvest could end your life in a matter of days. The next time you're having a bad day, remember our medieval ancestors. When your internet is slow, remember that they had no way to communicate beyond shouting distance. When you're stuck in traffic, remember that they walked everywhere and risked being murdered by bandits. When you complain about your job, remember that they worked until they literally dropped dead. Every modern convenience you take for granted, your smartphone, your car, your house, your job, your education, your medical care, your food, your entertainment, represents centuries of human progress and innovation. You are living better than the richest medieval king could have ever imagined. But here's the thing that might help you sleep tonight. We've come so far as a species. The creativity, ingenuity, and determination that lifted us out of medieval misery is the same human spirit that continues to solve problems and improve lives today. Every challenge we face now, from climate change to disease to poverty, is being tackled by people who refuse to accept that suffering is inevitable. If you've enjoyed this journey through medieval misery, Please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you'll know when we release new episodes of historical horror. What other terrible time periods would you like us to explore? Ancient Rome? The Industrial Revolution? The Ice Age? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're down there, tell us what modern convenience you're most grateful for after hearing about medieval life. Share this video with anyone who thinks they were born in the wrong era or who complains about modern life. Trust me, after watching this, they'll never take their heated house, clean water, and modern medicine for granted again. Sweet dreams, everyone. And remember, no matter how bad your day was, at least you didn't have to share a gomp stick with your neighbors or worry about dying from a toothache. Sleep well in your comfortable bed, in your clean room, with your full belly and your functioning immune system. You've earned it just by being born in the right century. Until next time, this has been another episode of Boring History for Sleep. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.